Let's look at the Balaur Arms 15th century arming sword from Kult of Athena. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now first up I should just apologise that this review is so late coming. I got this sword quite a long time ago. I've reviewed a couple of other products from the Balaur Arms line of Kult of Athena, link below to this product incidentally, and you can check out the other Balaur Arms available swords on Kult of Athena's website there. Now, yes, it's taken me a bit of a while to get around to this sword, and first up I should point out that this is the second generation model. I believe this is made by Windlass to the specs set out by Kult of Athena, who essentially own the brand name, shall we say, and the kind of mark of Balaur Arms. Now, Balaur Arms are and have been manufactured by various different makers, so you will find that different models within the Balaur Arms line, although they've all been made to spec for Kult of Athena, so it's their own brand name essentially, there will be differences between the swords and even between generations. And this is the case in terms of this 15th century arming sword. The first generation was made by a different company. I'm actually not 100% certain who was making the first generation because I've seen a couple of contrary bits of evidence, but there were some differences. So the crossguard on the first generation was curved. This is the second generation with a straight crossguard. I believe this is made by Windlass to spec for Kult of Athena, and I also believe that I've noticed on the website they say closeout. This is currently on at $219 US, so it's pretty damned cheap actually for the spec of the sword, but we'll get into the spec in a minute. But I'm not certain. I suspect that once this model's sold out, that will be it and they'll be gone, or that possibly there'll be a third generation, I don't know. But just to reiterate, if you're looking at other Balaur Arms swords, they might be made by completely different companies to different generations and different specs. So anything I say about this doesn't necessarily go for all of Balaur Arms, or even in this case, it doesn't go for the first generation of this sword either. So I'll try to be as concise and efficient with this review as possible. First of all, we're going to look at the positives, then we're going to look at some of the negatives, and then we're going to have a summing up. So the positives: it is a fast and lively sword, it is attractive to look at, and it comes in a wood cord, leather covered, hand stitched scabbard. So it's a complete unit. You don't just get the sword, you get the scabbard with it as well. And it has to be said that this sword as a total package for $220 strikes me as insanely good value. Okay, so for $220 you can't get very many swords at all of this overall package and quality. In terms of how the thing initially looks, it looks good quality. It certainly punches above its weight for $220. To be honest, the fit and finish overall of this looks like some swords which are $500–600 or even more in some cases. So it seems like incredibly good value. Now, we'll come back to the scabbard in a minute, but let's pull the sword out. So next thing to say about it is a good looking and well proportioned sword. The grip is not overly long for an arming sword. The hilt, the guard and pommel are rather basic and utilitarian. However, they're well finished and they're well proportioned, and they look like original medieval sword examples, although we'll talk specifically about those in a second. And the blade is an oakshot type 18 blade with a hollow grind to it and a central spine that's not quite a midrib, but it does have hollow grinding to it. And this is a super nimble and super quick sword. It weighs 895 grams. I've just weighed it on my very accurate scales, and it absolutely moves through the air fantastically. It's really nimble, really quick, and you could absolutely use this by itself, or you could use it with a buckler or a left-hand dagger or a pair of them, and it is absolutely moves and tracks beautifully. It's got a good centre of percussion with a node of resonance where it should do, and it just feels right in the hand, and it has good rotational feeling to it and feels absolutely fantastically. It comes sharp, and I can tell you it is quite sharp. I realise this will be important for some people, but here's a piece of paper, and this is straight at it. I've not touched this edge at all. You can see it's not super sharp, but if you find the right spot, it will slice somewhat. Okay, so it's not, let's flip it around to the other edge. There we go. If you find the right spot, it will bite and it will slice. I do not want to apply pressure to this edge and run my hand down it. It is sharp enough to cut bottles and milk jugs and whatever else you might like to cut with it. So it's not the sharpest sword in the world, but it's a pretty serviceable edge on it. And as we saw on this paper, it doesn't slice through paper fantastically, but it does slice through paper, and it will cut most basic backyard cutting targets pretty damn easily. Another positive thing to say about the sword is the scabbard. It's a fairly basic shape at the end there, but this stitching is actually very nicely done. Just get it to focus on that. There we go. The stitching's very nicely done down the back. It's not a perfect straight line, but nevertheless the stitching's fairly tidy. The wood core is done well. You've got a couple of kind of, we'll call it a rain flap at the top. You've got some risers on there, and the sword will fall out if you shake it that way. So it's not super tight, but it doesn't jangle around much. It's a pretty good fit, and honestly, although it might not be as tight as some custom made swords, that is the sort of fit I would expect to see on a lot of original medieval swords, and in fact it does correlate to lots of antique swords that pass through my hands. So overall it's a nice package. Another really important positive to say about this is the grip is fantastic on it. Very high quality grip, better than lots of more expensive swords I've seen. So if you look at that, cord impressed, it's got risers at top and bottom. Let's just pull it out there. And it's the overlap is down the edge here, and it's glued, and it's really finely done and a very well done grip. In terms of the peen, it is very tidily peened at the end there, so it's a full tang construction as you'd expect. Fully functional. I think this is something like 1070 or 1080. In fact, if it's windlass, it's probably 1080 steel. And if I'm just gingerly do this, because it is a sharp blade, you can see that it has good flex on it, and the flex is all in this portion of the blade, the second half of the blade. You can see there, and it returns perfectly to true, no problem at all there. And it does have good distal taper. It's not incredibly thick at the base. It's around 4.5 millimeters thick, 5 millimeters thick at the base here, and it does have distal taper all the way down, so that as you can see, it flexes in the second half of the blade, not the base of the blade. That distal taper is what largely, that and the hollow grinding, largely contribute to the fantastic feeling of this sword. Okay, so the negatives. What am I going to say about the negatives? Well, funnily enough, the main negative, there's two main negatives, but the main negative at the outset that I'd like to say is, to my mind, this is not really a 15th century arming sword. So the blade is an Oakshott Type 18 blade that was very popular right the way through the 15th century, but particularly in the second half of the 15th century. The problem with this hilt is this particular hilt design with this rather sort of smooth, flat-faced Globos sort of flat disc pommel, and that type of straight guard with just a rise at the middle, I would define really as a hilt style that's more of the late 14th century. So overall, this is a bit of a problematic sword to define in terms of its typology, because you've got a 15th century style blade married to what's really more of an end of the 14th century, mid to end of the 14th century hilt. Now, that being said, there are hilts like this which do overlap into the early 15th century. So for example, if we look at some of the Alexandrian swords, some of the ones which have the early single finger ring, in fact, without the finger, if you take the finger ring off, you do end up with a crossguard and a pommel which is somewhat similar to these. So where does this sit historically? It's a bit problematic because we've got this Type 18 blade. I would say that ideally, they should have really thought about the design of this crossguard and possibly the pommel to make it a bit more typical of the 15th century. You may care about this, or you might not care about it one tiny bit, but to me, when I'm looking at replica medieval swords, I'd like them to be recognisably of a type of medieval sword which I know originals exist of. This one's problematic. If you asked me to find in a museum or even a private collection a medieval sword which looks really like this, I'd be hard pressed. I can't think of any examples. I can only really think that this is a bit like an Alexandrian Type 19 blade, usually with those hilt, without the finger ring, married to a later 15th century arming sword blade. There we go. So if I had to place this in terms of date, I'd say, well, it looks a bit like, I guess you'd put it in the beginning of the 15th century. But Type 18 blades are not particularly popular yet at the beginning of the 15th century. Right, okay, so moving on from that, the second major criticism of this sword is it's got a lot of wobbliness. So looking up the blade, this is something which a lot of people have criticised with certain companies' blades, that they have too much rippling in the blade. In contrary to that, there are some swords which have virtually no rippling in the blade, and recently, as you will notice, in fact over the last 6 months, I've made various videos showing antique swords. Just grab one at random. We're looking on the blade, and these do have ripples in them. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Japanese wakizashi and katana, or European military sabres, just grab another one, of the gunpowder age, or whether you're talking about medieval European swords, or African swords, or whatever, Indian swords, most of them, if you look along the blade, have rippling. However, in a modern consumer world, if you look at top-end replicas of medieval swords, one of the things we look for is a very flat blade, and this is true of Japanese replica swords as well. You do still see some rippling, even in usually the top-end swords as well, because it's a product of the polishing process, the grinding and the polishing process, and the fact that we use wheels. If you use a larger flat platen, you reduce the chances of rippling, but historically flat platen wasn't used. They used wheels, grinding wheels and polishing wheels. Hence we do get some degree of rippling. And of course, forging a blade as opposed to grinding it from stock removal or whatever else. Anyway, there's various reasons why you end up with rippling. Now, you might be under the impression, therefore, that I am pro-rippling and anti-blades that don't have rippling, and that's not the case. The fact is that all I'm doing is pointing out that historical swords, whether it's good or bad, historical swords tend to have rippling in the blade, as does this. So, this has rippling in the blade. Why am I mentioning that as a negative point? Well, simply because I consider on this particular example, the rippling, whilst you could say it's historic, is a bit excessive. So for me, the two main criticisms of this sword are, number one, it's got too much rippling in the blade for what I consider decent, and secondly, that I don't think the blade and the hilt design really marry up to give a good analogue for a particular family of medieval swords. That's a bit of a mash-up. Okay, it's not really one thing or another. There is a third criticism as well, and that is I've got no problem with the pommel whatsoever, no problem with the grip. You've got good indexing and shape on the grip, fantastic finish on the grip. But I hate this guard, and I hate this guard for one specific reason. It's nothing to do with fit or finish exactly. I'll come to that in a second. If we look at the way that the blade goes into the guard here, it is actually fitted really, really well. Fantastically well. Better than most medieval swords. Okay, and again, this is another point that me and Todd, as in Todd Cutler, have made in previous videos, is that fit, we obsess about it with modern replicas, and with the high-end swords, they have an, you know, you could only get the tiniest piece of paper, a micron in there between the blade and the guard. They fit perfectly. This one fits pretty damned well and way better than most medieval originals. So that is great. The shape of it is great. It is all rock solid. It's straight, it's symmetrical, everything else perfect. My main criticism of the guard is it hurts. It is really sharp edged. So these angles on here are really, really, I mean, they're perfect, but they are really uncomfortable against your hand. It doesn't matter whether you're holding the sword in a hammer grip or a handshake grip, your finger will rub on the underneath of there, and it is too sharp edged, it is too angular, it needs to be rounded off. Obviously you can do that yourself, and to be completely frank, for $220 this is still a great package. You can still do that. It will take you 5 minutes with some wet and dry sandpaper. You can make that as rounded as you like. If you want to put your finger over the guard, which, as I've mentioned with the Alexandrian swords, leads to the finger ring, you will also find that both top sides of that guard does wear on your finger. So, I don't like this guard because I don't particularly like the look of it and the shape of it. I think it could have been a bit more refined and a nicer shape with rounded corners, maybe little turned up ends or swollen ends or something. It just looks a bit too plain and boring. and those sharp edges I'm not a fan of. But to reiterate, the main two flaws I've got with this sword are, what is it a replica of? Which particular family of swords? It doesn't really seems to sit with 2 feet in two different, slightly different eras, and the rippling in the blade is slightly excessive. But here's my summing up. For $220, I think this is an absolutely brilliant value for money. This is made of really good steel. So I've got a workbench here. I'm just going to push the blade right the way into it, completely straight. I'll push it right the way into this post, bend, completely straight. It is really well heat treated, pretty good sharpening, good edge geometry, so if you want to refine that sharpening it should be dead easy. It handles absolutely fantastically. It's really nimble. It handles like a later side sword basically. It's super nimble and quick. Less than 900 grams, and with a wood lined scabbard, and with really good leather work, and with a brilliant grip. So I think as a project sword to refine that sharpening, smooth those corners on that guard, maybe, I don't know, maybe even do a bit of file work on the guard. As a £220 kind of improvement project, it's worth it. And the rippling in the blade is a bit excessive and could be improved, but it's also within historical parameters as well. So there we go, the 15th century arming sword from Balaur Arms, as found on Kult of Athena, their own brand. This version, I believe, made by Windlass. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm like 95% sure this is made by Windlass. It's got good steel, good heat treatment, good edge geometry. It's hollow ground, feels great in the hand, beautiful grip, good pommel. The guard needs a bit of a refining, and the edge could be made even better, but it comes with the scabbard. Great package. I hope this has been a useful review, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.